Hello, my name is Chris. Welcome to the video blog for appenthesis.blogspot.com. We have been asking the question, does Daniel's 70th week necessarily exclude the church? In our last post, we started looking at some logical fallacies and some false assumptions that say that the church has to be removed so that the tribulation can start. We're going to continue where we left off. What about Old Testament prophecies? It could be argued that the emphasis of the tribulation and the day of the Lord in the Old Testament is primarily Jewish, that there's no mention of the church, and therefore the church won't be around for the tribulation. Well, it's true that the church isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, but that's because it's the Old Testament and the church is the New Testament. And it's also true that the scriptures written to the Jewish nation of Israel focus on the Jewish nation of Israel. But isn't that what we would expect? We wouldn't expect it to mention, Africa or Australia or anybody else. It's not written to them. We could, using that same logic, we could just as easily argue that the absence of the church from prophecies predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD prove that the church would be raptured before the coming of General Titus. You see, the Old Testament talks about the Jerusalem will be destroyed, and it gives very specific time frame for it, but the church is never mentioned. Well, that must mean that the church isn't there, but the church was there. It happened in 70 AD, as we saw in our last post. General Titus came in, destroyed the city, but the Christians pulled out of the city. When they saw the armies surrounding the city, they followed the Lord's orders, and they managed to flee up into the mountains to safety. So an argument from silence doesn't prove anything, and you can't do that. What about the Olivet Discourse? In Matthew 24, the Lord Jesus is talking with his disciples about future things. This is known as the Olivet Discourse because it takes place on the Mount of Olives. And I've read an argument that goes something like this. Because the Olivet Discourse is addressed to Jews, and it primarily concerns Jews, then the tribulation period also primarily concerns the Jewish nation. It's not about the church. Well, that's a false argument because the Olivet Discourse is spoken to Christians. The Lord Jesus was addressing believers. The unsaved nation of Israel was not gathered out on the Mount of Olives to listen to Jesus. It was his disciples. It was the believers. So the subject of the Olivet Discourse was believers. We already talked about the word elect in one of our earlier posts, and we've shown that the word elect was referring to Christians, and the audience was Christians. And you've got to remember the timing of the Olivet Discourse. This discourse, this talk that Jesus gives to his disciples, it was given just 2 days before the Upper Room Discourse. And the Upper Room is whenever Jesus took off the towel and washed their feet, and they did the Lord's Supper for the first time. So we've got to watch our time frames here. These same disciples were told just 1 week later, gathered out on another hill, that they were told to preach the gospel to all the Gentile nations, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you. And surely the all things that they were told to teach included that they should watch for the Lord's return immediately after the tribulation of those days, Matthew 24. So the Olivet Discourse actually proves that the church will be in the tribulation. What about the book of Revelation? Isn't it a very Jewish book? There's a lot of Jewish terminology. It mentions the temple, it mentions the incense, it mentions the altar, the tribes, the sacrifices. And this is all true. The terminology does harken back to the Old Testament, but that's merely because the Old Testament priesthood was a shadow of the reality found in heaven, and that is where the book of Revelation is taking place. A lot of times we're seeing the unveiling of things in heaven. Again, I'm going to say it this way. If there is a great multitude of blood-bought martyrs who come out of great tribulation, Revelation 7:9. And these blood-bought martyrs of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, how is this tribulation primarily Jewish? It's primarily about these blood-bought martyrs. It's primarily about the church, isn't it? There's a couple, several millions in Jerusalem at this time, but billions of other people have died. What about the absence of the word church? Now, this is a key one. What about the absence of the word church between Revelation chapter 4 and Revelation chapter 19? Doesn't this prove that the church is removed? Well, the church isn't mentioned in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1 either. But every pre-tribulationist sees the church in that verse. It says John, John. The word church is not used in Revelation 19, but everybody can plainly see that the church is present, coming down on the white horses with the Lord Jesus. The word used there is wife or saints. It's not the word church. If the absence of the word church in Revelation 4 through 19 proves that the church is not on earth at this time, doesn't it also prove that she's not in heaven at this time? Seeing that we're looking into a lot of heaven during the chapters, Revelation chapters 4 through 19, that there's no mention of the word church. She's not present in earth or in heaven. She just disappears. You see, that is the logical ending of faulty reasoning that looks at the tribulation and says the church isn't there, that she has to be pulled out before the tribulation starts. And I also wanted to give this little side note. This is for our hyper-dispensationalist friends. Many hyper-dispensationalists say that the books of Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter are written specifically for the tribulation saints and not for today's church. They call them time capsule epistles. I've heard it said that. If this is so, if Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter are not written to the church, which is, raptured out before the tribulation, if they're written specifically to the tribulation saints, then how do these poor tribulation saints call for the elders of the church when they're sick? James chapter 5, verse 14. If this is so, how does the church that is at Babylon salute them, seeing that the church was raptured out before they even got on the scene? 1 Peter 5:13. And how is this church at Babylon elected together with these tribulation saints when these tribulation saints aren't part of the church? Even though 1 Peter 1:23 says that his audience is born again. How are these tribulation saints born again, but not members of the church, but elected together with the church, saluted by the church, and calling for the church when they're sick? Hyper-dispensationalism is way out there. That's on the lunatic fringe. But so is the pre-trib rapture. It's based on false assumptions, faulty reasoning, logical fallacies, and everything else that's false. And we'll look into to some more of this later as we go. For more information, check out my blog, apenthesis.blogspot.com. My name's Chris. Thank you.